They told us the mud on Tartarus 9 would dissolve bone. They told us the atmospheric pressure would turn our lungs to wet ash. What the Galactic Coalition didn't understand was that humans don't just survive hell. Give us a long weekend and a campfire, and we'll turn it into a resort. Subcommander Prax did not hate humans. Hate required an emotional investment that his species, the Valerians, deemed inefficient. He simply found them utterly, exhaustingly illogical. He sat in the dimly lit observation bunker overlooking Sector 4, nursing a tepid mug of nutrient broth. Below him, visible through the reinforced plasteel viewport and a dozen holographic surveillance feeds, lay the training grounds of Tartarus 9. It wasn't a planet meant to kill you immediately. That would teach nothing. It was designed to kill you slowly, stripping away morale, dignity, and sanity before your body finally gave out. The air was thick with sulfuric mist. The gravity was a punishing 1.4 standard. The mud clung to boots like wet cement, and the local flora had a nasty habit of releasing neurotoxic spores if stepped on. The Coalition used this rock to test the psychological fortitude of newly integrated species. Most species tapped out. They pressed their emergency extraction beacons within 48 hours. The towering, heavily armored Krell had lasted 3 days before the isolation and crushing gravity broke their minds. Now it was humanity's turn. Biometrics are stabilizing, a technician murmured from the console to Prax's left. Heart rates are elevated. Cortisol levels are irregular. Prax leaned forward, his mandibles clicking softly. Irregular how? They are spiking, but not sustaining. It is as if they are artificially suppressing their own panic response. On the primary monitor, the human drop pod sat half-buried in the grey, bubbling muck. The hatch blew off with a sharp, concussive thud, sending a spray of acidic sludge into the mist. 3 figures stumbled out. Prax pulled up their dossiers. Garrison, infantry, 40s. Heavy scarring on his left arm from a previous engagement. Chloe, combat medic, 30s. Slight build, high intelligence markers. Miles, combat engineer, 20s. Disciplinary record thicker than his training manual. They looked exactly as fragile as Prax expected. Bipeds with no natural armor, no redundant organs, and a shockingly narrow range of acceptable operating temperatures. Gravity hit them first. Garrison dropped to one knee, the breath rushing out of him in a visible white cloud. Chloe gripped the side of the smoking pod, her knuckles turning white as she fought to keep her spine straight. Miles just leaned over and violently emptied his stomach into the mud. Good, Prax thought. The baseline is established. The braking process begins. Note the time, Prax instructed the technician. I project extraction requests within 30 hours. The gravity alone will exhaust their muscle glycogen. On the monitor, Miles wiped his mouth with the back of a thickly gloved hand. He spat a string of saliva into the mud, looked at the grey, miserable sky, and did something Prax hadn't anticipated. He laughed. It wasn't a hysterical laugh. It was a dry, scraping chuckle. The audio feed picked it up clearly. Well, Miles rasped, adjusting the heavy plasma rifle slung across his chest. At least it's not raining. Right on cue, a thunderclap rolled across the toxic swamp. Fat, heavy drops of freezing, mildly acidic water began to pelt their armor, hissing faintly as it ate at the uppermost layer of ablative paint. Chloe looked at Miles, her face pale inside her helmet visor. You just had to say it, didn't you, you absolute idiot? Garrison grunted, finally pushing himself up from the mud. The servos in his mechanized exoskeleton whined in protest under the 1.4 G load. Stow it, both of you. Check your seals. Grab the heavy crates. We need high ground before this sludge turns into a flash flood. They didn't panic. They didn't huddle in the pod. They moved with a practiced, miserable efficiency. Garrison shouldered a supply crate that weighed nearly 200 pounds in this gravity. his face contorted, veins bulging in his neck. But he didn't stop. Prax watched them hike up a jagged incline of obsidian rock, slipping, cursing, dragging each other up by their harnesses when they fell. Their stamina is depleting, the technician noted. Respiration is approaching critical limits. Let them climb, Prax said softly. The summit of Ridge 81 is fully exposed to the thermal downdrafts. When night falls, the temperature will drop to -20 standard. They will freeze, they will realize the futility of their stubbornness, and they will call for extraction. 6 hours later, night swallowed Sector 4. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the violent purple flashes of atmospheric lightning. The temperature plummeted. Prax returned to the command center after a brief rest cycle. He checked the monitors, expecting to see the flashing blue light of 3 extraction beacons. Instead, he saw a glowing orange dot on the thermal imaging. "What is that?" Prax snapped, pointing a long, spindly finger at the screen. "Is there a malfunction in their thermal regulators? Is their gear overloading?" The technician looked baffled. "No, Sub-Commander. They started a fire." "Impossible. The atmosphere is heavily saturated with nitrogen. The ambient moisture. They cannibalize the chemical flares from the drop pod. They use the magnesium casings to ignite the fibrous stalks of the indigenous rotwood trees. The wood is mildly toxic, but it burns slow and hot." Prax zoomed the optical feed in on the ridge. The 3 humans were huddled beneath an overhang of rock they had carved out, using localized mining charges. A small, roaring fire crackled in the center of their camp. They had stripped off their heavy outer armor. Chloe was holding a metal canteen over the flames, using a bent piece of wire. Garrison was sharpening a combat knife against a flat stone, the rhythmic shk-shk echoing over the audio feed. Miles was leaning back against the rock wall, his boots propped dangerously close to the fire, humming a discordant, rhythmic tune. "This is awful," Chloe said, pulling the canteen back. She took a cautious sip of whatever she had boiled, her face screwed up in disgust. "Tastes like burnt tires and copper." Miles held out his hand. "Pass it here. Beggars can't be choosers, Doc." He took a swig, choked, pounded his chest and exhaled heavily. "Smooth. Really opens up the pores." Garrison didn't look up from his knife. "Drink it and shut up. Tomorrow we map the perimeter. Sleep in shifts. 2 hours on, 4 off. Miles, you take first watch. If you fall asleep, I'll feed you to whatever is howling down in that swamp." "Copy that, boss," Miles said, pulling a ration bar from his pocket. He chewed on it, staring out into the pitch-black, freezing, toxic wasteland. And he smiled. Prax stared at the screen, utterly unmoored. They were cold, they were exhausted. They were breathing mildly toxic air and drinking foul water. Why weren't they broken? By day 4, the novelty of simply surviving had worn off, or so Prax thought. The Coalition training manual dictated that if environmental hazards failed to break a subject's resolve, biological pressure must be applied. The ecosystem of Tartarus 9 was not merely passive, it was violently active. "Initiate Phase 2, Prax ordered. The technician hesitated. "Sub-Commander, standard protocol suggests a gradual introduction of predatory stimuli. The humans are already operating under severe physical strain. They are brewing stimulants from the toxic flora," Prax said, his voice flat. He pointed at the screen, where Chloe was carefully extracting sap from a rotwood root, boiling it down into a viscous black sludge that the humans were consuming with alarming enthusiasm. "They are not under strain, they are camping. Initiate Phase 2, full deployment." Deep within the swamp, heavy containment doors ground open. The Coalition called them stalkers. They were apex predators, engineered specifically for this environment. Six-legged, heavily muscled beasts the size of small ground transports. They possessed chameleonic hides that rendered them nearly invisible, and jaws capable of crushing plasteel. 5 of them were released into Sector 4, their tracking implants immediately locked onto the thermal signatures of the human camp on Ridge 81. Prax watched the tactical display as 5 red icons moved swiftly and silently through the grey mud, converging on the ridge. "Time to contact?" Prax asked. 4 minutes, the technician replied. "Should I prep the medevac drones? The stalkers are programmed to incapacitate, not kill. But human physiology is—" "Prep them," Prax agreed, "but do not launch until they beg for it." On the ridge, the humans were busy. They had spent the last 2 days reinforcing their overhang. Garrison was meticulously cleaning his plasma rifle. Miles and Chloe were arguing about the structural integrity of a barricade they had built from felled tree trunks and hardened mud. Suddenly Garrison stopped. He didn't look up. He didn't shout. He simply froze. "Movement," Garrison whispered, his voice barely carrying over the ambient wind. "Down the slope, 3 o'clock." Chloe immediately dropped the mud she was holding and snatched her sidearm, sliding into the shadows behind a rock. Miles didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he grabbed a heavy metal pole he had ripped from the drop pod's internal framing. "I don't see anything on thermals," Chloe hissed, tapping her visor. "Neither do I," Garrison replied, slowly raising his rifle. "But the wind just died, and I smell ozone. Something's cloaked." Prax leaned forward, gripping the edge of the console. How did he know? The stalkers emit a negligible electromagnetic signature. A Valerian sensor suite wouldn't detect that without a dedicated scan. The first stalker struck. It uncloaked mid-leap, a massive blur of muscle, fangs, and shifting camouflage. It aimed directly for Garrison, a silent, lethal strike meant to pin him to the ground and snap his collarbone. It never made contact. Garrison didn't flinch. He dropped backward, sliding through the slick mud, and fired his plasma rifle point-blank into the creature's chest. The superheated bolt didn't penetrate the beast's heavy subdermal plating, but the sheer kinetic force knocked it off trajectory. It crashed into the mud, roaring, a sound like grinding metal. Before the beast could recover, Miles was there. He didn't run away. He ran toward the monster. Miles swung the metal pod strut like a baseball bat. The heavy steel connected with the stalker's jaw with a sickening crack. The beast thrashed, swiping a massive claw that caught Miles across the chest, sending him flying backward into a puddle of acidic sludge. "Miles!" Chloe yelled. 2 more stalkers broke cover, rushing the flanks. Standard Coalition doctrine stated that when outmatched by apex predators, a species should form a tight defensive circle and prepare for extraction. The humans did the exact opposite. They broke formation and attacked. Chloe threw a localized concussion grenade not at the beasts, but at the rock wall above them. The explosion showered the area in jagged shrapnel and blinding dust. The stalkers, heavily reliant on sight and vibration, shrieked in confusion, their cloaking fields flickering and failing as the dust coated their hides. Garrison used the chaos to close the distance. He wasn't shooting anymore. The close quarters made the rifle a liability. He drew his combat knife. He vaulted over a fallen log, landed squarely on the back of a disoriented stalker, and drove the blade directly into the sensory cluster behind its neck. The beast convulsed, threw Garrison off, and collapsed, dead. The remaining stalkers, witnessing the sudden, violent death of their packmate, paused. Their programming dictated that they were the hunters. Being hunted was not a variable they understood. Miles, groaning, pulled himself out of the mud. His chest plate was deeply gouged, but the armor had held. He spat blood, picked up his metal pipe, and hit it against his palm. "That all you got, ugly?" Miles yelled at the shadows. The remaining 4 stalkers retreated, melting back into the optical camouflage of the swamp. Silence fell over the ridge. In the observation bunker, The technician was hyperventilating slightly. Sub-Commander. They killed it. A Class 4 bioweapon. They killed it with a piece of scrap metal and a knife. Prax couldn't speak. His throat felt dry. He watched the monitors as Garrison got up, wiping mud and neon blue alien blood off his visor. Chloe rushed over to Miles, checking his chest plate, her hands moving quickly and efficiently. "I'm fine, Doc," Miles wheezed, waving her off. "Just bruised." Garrison walked over to the massive dead stalker. He kicked its heavy flank. It didn't move. "Look at the muscle density on this thing," Garrison muttered. He pulled his knife out of the creature's neck, wiping the blade on his pants. He looked over his shoulder at Miles and Chloe. "Hey, how much you want to bet this thing is edible?" Chloe stared at him. "Are you insane? It's a bioengineered bioweapon on a toxic Deathworld. It will probably melt your intestines." "We boil the local sap into coffee," Miles pointed out, limping over. "I say we cut a flank steak off it. If it turns blue over the fire, we don't eat it. If it sears nicely, well, I'm getting pretty sick of the ration bars." Prax watched, utterly paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated madness of what he was witnessing. They weren't calling for extraction. They were butchering the Coalition's most feared predator. 2 hours later, the fire was built up into a roaring blaze. Slabs of pale, dense meat were skewered on metal rods, sizzling over the flames. The smell of roasting fat, alien synthetic fat, wafted up toward the atmospheric sensors. Garrison took a bite of a slightly charred chunk. He chewed slowly. Chloe and Miles watched him with bated breath. Garrison swallowed. He looked at the meat, then looked at his squad mates. "A little tough," Garrison said, his voice deadly serious. "Needs salt. But it tastes like pork." Miles let out a whoop, grabbing a skewer for himself. "Hell yeah! Real food!" Chloe sighed, shaking her head. But she grabbed a piece too. Within minutes, the three of them were sitting around the fire, laughing, eating the very nightmare that was supposed to break their minds, and trading stories about worse deployments they'd had. "This isn't so bad," Miles said through a mouthful of meat, gesturing to the miserable, lightning-streaked sky. "Reminds me of a training camp back in Alaska, except the mosquitoes here are bigger." "Yeah," Garrison agreed, leaning back and resting his boots near the fire. "Not a bad spot for a vacation. Wonder if we can catch another one of those cloaking dogs tomorrow. I want to see if we can make a cloak out of its skin." In the bunker, Prax slumped back into his command chair. "Sub-Commander?" the technician asked nervously. "What are your orders?" Prax looked at the biometric readouts. The humans' cortisol levels weren't just dropping. Their dopamine levels were rising. They weren't surviving anymore. They were enjoying themselves. "Shut off the feeds," Prax whispered, rubbing his temples. "And get Supervisor Kale on the comms. We have a problem." Supervisor Kyle was not a creature prone to outward displays of emotion. As a senior adjudicator of the Coalition's species integration program, his job was to categorize, evaluate, and quantify. He stared at the holographic projection on Prax's desk, his 4 compound eyes blinking in a slow, asynchronous rhythm. "You are telling me," Kyle said, his voice a synthesized drone through his vocal translator, "that the bipeds are consuming a Class 4 bioweapon for sustenance." Prax stood rigidly at attention. "Yes, Supervisor. They seasoned it with salt from their ration kits." Kyle's mandibles twitched. "And the environmental stresses? The 1.4 standard gravity? The atmospheric toxicity?" "They complain about it constantly," Prax admitted, pulling up an audio log. "However, the complaints are not desperate. They are recreational. They treat the gravity as a form of resistance training." The medic, Chloe, has deduced that the local flora's sap contains a mild stimulant. They are brewing it and trading it for watch duties. Kyle fell silent. The holographic feed showed the 3 humans currently sitting in a circle under their rock overhang. The sky above them was a bruised, violently churning purple. The temperature was 20 below zero. Miles was juggling 3 smooth stones. Garrison was carving a tally mark into the stock of his rifle. Chloe was carefully stitching a tear in Miles's undersuit, using a makeshift needle crafted from a stalker bone. They looked battered. Miles had a dark, ugly bruise spreading across his jaw. Garrison moved with the stiffness of a man whose joints were grinding into dust. Chloe's eyes were ringed with deep, exhausted shadows, but their biometric feeds told a different story. Their heart rates were calm. Their brain activity showed steady, cohesive patterns. They were working as a single, unbreakable organism. "Unacceptable," Kyle finally said. "This facility is designed to establish the breaking point of a species. If they do not break, our metrics are compromised. If the Coalition admits a species that does not fear Tartarus 9, we disrupt the entire hierarchy of military deployment." "What do you suggest, Supervisor?" "Initiate Protocol Omega." Prax felt a cold dread settle in his primary stomach. "Supervisor, Protocol Omega is designed for containment breaches. It initiates an artificial Category 5 cyclonic storm and releases the subterranean crawler swarms. It is a death sentence. They are already dead, Sub-Commander. They simply refuse to acknowledge it. Flood the sector. Break them." Kyle severed the connection. Prax stared at the empty space where the hologram had been. He looked back at the monitors. Miles had dropped one of the stones. Garrison was chuckling, a low, rumbling sound. Prax reached for the command console. His long fingers hesitated over the authorization keys. He didn't want to kill them. He wanted to understand them. But orders were orders. He keyed the sequence. Down in Sector 4, the wind stopped. The silence was sudden and absolute. The constant, hissing drizzle of acid rain ceased. The roaring of the distant mud falls muted. Garrison stopped laughing. He looked up at the sky. The purple clouds were twisting, forming a massive, unnatural spiral directly above Ridge 81. "Visors down," Garrison snapped. The easygoing campfire demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by cold, hard military conditioning. "Seal your suits." "What is it?" Chloe asked, locking her helmet into place with a sharp click. "Pressure is dropping," Miles reported, tapping the wrist-mounted display on his gauntlet. "Fast. Really fast. Boss, we got a localized low-pressure system forming right on top of us. It's a manufactured storm." "They're turning up the dial," Garrison grunted. He grabbed his plasma rifle. "Stow the gear. Tie down the tarp." They had skinned the dead stalker yesterday, stretching its thick, chameleonic hide over a frame of rotwood. It made a surprisingly durable tent. They scrambled to secure the corners, driving bone pegs deep into the rocky soil. Then the ground began to vibrate. It wasn't the heavy, rhythmic thud of a stalker. It was a high-frequency buzz, like 1,billion tiny motors vibrating in unison. The mud at the base of the ridge began to bubble and churn. A sea of black, segmented bodies erupted from the swamp. Crawlers, scavenger insects the size of domestic hounds, equipped with mandibles that could chew through starship hulls. They flooded out of the subterranean tunnels by the thousands, a writhing, clicking tide of chitin and hunger, driven to the surface by the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. "Contact!" Miles yelled, raising his rifle. "Thousands of them, coming up the slope!" "Conserve ammo," Garrison ordered. "They're swarming. We need a choke point. Chloe, prep the incendiaries. Miles, get that power cell from the pod." The wind hit them like a physical wall. The cyclonic storm touched down, tearing rotwood trees out by their roots and throwing them into the swamp. The howling gale was deafening. Acid hail began to pelt the ridge, shattering against the stalker hide tent. The first wave of crawlers crested the ridge. Garrison fired. The plasma bolt ripped through the front lines, flash-boiling the internal fluids of 3 crawlers at once. They burst in a spray of green ichor. The swarm didn't even slow down. They climbed over the steaming husks of their dead, clicking furiously. Chloe threw an incendiary grenade. The blast of white-hot phosphorus engulfed a dozen insects, the intense heat melting their chitinous armor. They screeched, a horrifying metallic sound, and collapsed. "Miles!" Garrison roared over the storm. "Now!" Miles dragged the drop pod's auxiliary power cell to the edge of the barricade. It was heavy, cylindrical, and humming with unstable energy. "Fire in the hole!" he screamed, kicking it hard. The cell rolled down the steep, rocky incline, bouncing right into the thickest part of the swarm. "Hit it!" Miles yelled, diving behind the barricade. Garrison didn't miss. He tracked the rolling cell, calculated the trajectory in a fraction of a second, and pulled the trigger. The plasma bolt struck the containment casing. The explosion defied description. A dome of blinding blue light expanded across the slope, vaporizing mud, rock, and hundreds of crawlers in a microsecond. The shockwave hit the ridge a moment later, throwing Garrison against the rock wall and shattering the barricade. The noise faded, leaving only a ringing in their ears and the howling of the wind. Below them, the slope was gone. In its place was a glowing, glassed-over crater. The surviving crawlers at the base of the ridge were scattering, their hive mind broken by the sheer, overwhelming violence of the blast. Under the stalker hide tent, Chloe pushed debris off her chest. She looked over at Miles, who was covered in dirt, grinning like a madman. Garrison was already back on his feet, rifle raised, scanning the smoke. "Clear!" Garrison coughed, his armor scorched black. "Swarm is retreating." Up in the bunker, Prax stared at the tactical display. The swarm was routed. The storm was raging, but the humans' makeshift shelter was holding. The stalker hide was entirely impervious to the acid hail. They hadn't just survived Protocol Omega. They had weaponized their own drop pod to beat it. The technician beside Prax slowly took off his headset. "Sub-Commander, their extraction window opens in 4 hours. What do we do?" Prax looked at the glowing blips on the screen. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion, mixed with an entirely un-Valerian sense of awe. "We go get them," Prax said, "before they figure out how to shoot down the storm." The Coalition extraction ship hovered over Ridge 81, its massive repulsor engines blasting the toxic mist away in concentric circles. The ramp lowered heavily, grinding against the obsidian rock. Prax stood at the top of the ramp, flanked by a squad of heavily armed Krell peacekeepers. He wore a full, pressurized hazard suit. He expected to find the humans huddled in a cave, traumatized, begging for the sterile safety of a Coalition medical bay. Instead, he stepped into a settlement. The barricade had been rebuilt, reinforced with the fused glass from the explosion. The stalker hide tent was stretched taut, shedding the acid rain with ease. A smokestack, built from hollowed-out rotwood logs and mud, vented a steady stream of wood smoke into the air. Garrison stood by the fire, a large piece of roasted crawler meat in his hand. He looked up at the dropship, his visor retracted, exposing his scarred face to the freezing, toxic air. "About time," Garrison shouted over the engine noise. We were running out of coffee. Prax walked slowly down the ramp. The Krell guards gripped their weapons tightly, eyeing the scattered, butchered remains of the apex predators with deep unease. Miles stepped out from behind the barricade. He had fashioned a shoulder pauldron out of a stalker skull. He looked feral. He looked completely at home. "You are Sub-Commander Prax," Garrison said, taking a bite of the meat. He gestured to the ship. "Is the test over, or is this another phase?" Prax stared at him. "The test is concluded. You have survived." Chloe emerged from the tent, slinging a heavy duffel bag of gear over her shoulder. "Survived? Buddy, we thrived. Honestly, if the gravity wasn't trying to compress my spine, I'd ask for release." "You defeated a Class 4 Predator," Prax said, his vocal translator struggling to convey his bewilderment. "You detonated a localized nuclear equivalent, to repel a subterranean swarm. You ate the bioweapons. Miles shrugged. Protein is protein, man. You guys want some on the way back? We got leftover stalker jerky. Tastes like a tire, but it keeps you going. Prax looked at the jerky Miles was holding out. He looked at the fortress of mud and bone. He looked at the 3 humans, standing tall in a gravity field that should have crippled them, breathing air that should have choked them. No, Prax said softly. Keep your rations. He turned back to the dropship, his mind already composing the report. He knew what he was going to write. Kyle wouldn't like it. The Coalition wouldn't believe it. But it was the truth. Humanity did not conquer Deathworlds. They gentrified them. As the dropship lifted off, leaving the scarred, burning surface of Tartarus 9 behind, Prax realized something that chilled him far more than the freezing rain outside. If this was what humans did when they were trapped in hell, what would they do when they were unleashed on the galaxy? And that is why the Galactic Coalition officially classified humanity not as a species to be tested, but as a force of nature to be avoided. You don't throw humans into hell to break them. You do it, and they just build a better fire. If you loved this story of human resilience and absolute defiance, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss another HFY tale. Share this video with your friends, and let me know in the comments, what alien nightmare would you barbecue first? See you in the next one.